Now we see how in Japan in 1970 there was complete destruction in the city. At this time in Tokyo, many magicians fought against terrifying monsters, and as soon as their spell was ready, they began to cast it. They released their magic which began to attack the monsters, and immediately after that there was a loud explosion. But still, as soon as the dust began to settle, they saw that the monster had survived. But the guys couldn't understand why their attack didn't even scratch the monsters. Well, as soon as they started looking closely, they saw many monsters appearing from other sides. And one of the guys began to sob and cowardly with fear because he began to understand that now they were all going to die. And at the same moment one of the monsters began to use fire that seemed to be born from his huge paws, and those guys were already preparing for death. After all, they saw how a huge fireball began to fly towards them. But suddenly something strange happened. I didn't realize that everyone was still alive. And all because some mysterious guy appeared and was able to stop the attack of the monsters. But the guys still recognized this guy and began to rejoice that he had finally come to their aid. But then the hero turned around and began to tell the guys that they did a good job. And at that very moment all those guys standing behind him began to sob with joy. But then the hero began to shout that they should all retreat and leave this battle to him. And just a second the guys began to obey him and run away. But there were also guys who I didn't understand. Should they really run away and leave him alone? But then another guy answered his friend that what kind of person is he really? And the fact that he is the founder of magic and he is the strongest mage, and the fact that he is the strongest person famous by Ichikami Itsumi. And suddenly the guy began to wipe away his tears and tell his friend that everything is right, and this is exactly the person who is standing there now. Well, our hero, standing in front of the monsters, was full of determination, and he knew that he could deal with these terrifying monsters. But before he had time to notice, many different monsters surrounded him, and one of them decided that he would attack first. But our hero realized that this attack was too slow and he immediately jumped into the air, and stretching out his hand, he began to cast a spell, because of which a bright light began to glow at the tips of his fingers. Well, after a few minutes, most of the monsters were destroyed and they were lying helpless on the earth. And putting out his hand, our hero began to tell them to come over, and as soon as most of the monsters came within arm's reach of him, another spell began to be cast and a bright light was heard that illuminated the floor of the city. One day, a bunch of monsters suddenly appeared all over the world. This event became known as the disaster that humanity's weapons were completely useless against monsters. However, humanity opened its eyes and noticed the possibilities of magic. Only she was able to defeat the monsters. The battle between monsters and humanity lasted more than 10 years. But now we, together with our beloved viewers, will return to the present, and only one guy could save the whole world. Well, you all ask why you. Well, as soon as our hero raised his head, he saw the demon lord in front of him. And this is a top-ranked monster boss disaster. An enormous magical power and pressure emanated from it, and despite the fact that his entire body was cut up, suddenly our hero looked that he suddenly began to use magic at the 14th level. So he decided to use his power from the very beginning, and after a bright flash, our hero noticed that he began to use 6-element compound magic. But our hero noticed this and began to build a protective wall of stones and branches in front of him. But still it was very difficult for him to restrain such a huge force that was pressing on him from all sides. And while protecting himself with strength, the hero suddenly noticed something strange, and immediately after that there was a huge explosion, and our hero began to fall to the ground with minor injuries. Well, as soon as he flew to the ground, he managed to group and land on his feet. Well, as soon as he raised his head, he saw the demon lord in front of him. And he realized that he was strong and this was the strongest monster he had fought with. But now he understood that there was no way he could lose to him, and the fact that he now has no other choice. And as soon as he concentrated, he began to release terrifying power and strength from his body. After all, my strength is determined by its level, and the number of magic circles determines this level. And the highest level that the demon lord could reach was 14 circles. Well, the maximum limit for our hero is 15 laps. As soon as he used the 15th level and his skill Absolute Emptiness, a bright light appeared that began to demolish everyone in its path. And after that, in the same place where the battle took place, there was simply desert left due to the excess of magical power, and the demon lord's crown began to evaporate into thin air. But at the same moment our hero began to fall to the ground exhausted. But he still understood that he had defeated the boss. Thanks to this disaster, the end would finally come. But he still used up all his magic, and the fact that he will die as a great sage. This is a good way to go, and the fact that he lived a good life. And as soon as he closed his eyes, the bright light that began to appear near his body shone brighter and brighter, and suddenly his magical soul began to emerge from his chest, and as soon as the magical soul separated from the body, it began to head in an unknown direction, and after a few seconds she was already flying to some building, and flying through the window, the soul saw a body lying in a hospital bed, and flying even closer she merged with him, and at the same moment the guy lying on the hospital bed began to twitch his hand. And suddenly he jumped up and began to look around, but he was surprised by the fact that he was alive and even after he had used up all his magic. And at the same moment, as soon as he turned his head towards where the mirror was, he couldn't believe his eyes what he just saw. After all, he didn't see himself but some strange guy and he couldn't understand who the hell he was. But at the same moment a doctor and a nurse began to enter the room. And now they saw a frightened guy who looked at himself in the mirror and immediately began to turn towards them. And a little later the doctor asked the guy to lie down on the hospital bed because he had to examine him. And suddenly the doctor was surprised at what he saw because he simply could not believe it. And the fact that the guy lost consciousness and was in critical condition as a result of a traffic accident, but had already fully recovered as if he had been healed by holy magic. But the guy suddenly thought about it. Because this is most likely because his body is indeed automatically healed by holy magic. But he would be reassured by the words that the doctor said about the traffic accident. But while the nurse was dressing him, he began to ask the doctor if his magic power had been healed, to which the doctor replied what he meant by magic power. But the guy continued to say that during the disaster he fought with monsters. But the doctor and the nurse could not understand what he was saying and whether he had really lost his mind. And the doctor suddenly began asking the guy if he could tell him his name and the current year, to which the guy replied that his name is Minato, and now it must be 1970. But the doctor immediately realized that he had post-traumatic syndrome, and it looked like memory damage, and the fact that his name is Minato and now it's 2023. Well, Minato just couldn't believe these words. He didn't fully understand. Is it really true? And the fact that now is 2023 and looking at the doctor and nurse, he realized that they were definitely not lying. But at the same moment his attention was attracted by the TV that stood nearby and the fact that it was so thin and with such a clear image. And the calendar that stood near the TV showed that it was now 2023, to press something on it. But Minato, noticing this, could not understand what kind of small device it was because he had never seen such a thing before. And the fact that he is really now in the future, and now he is definitely convinced of this. But the doctor began to raise his hand and show with his palm that the disaster he mentioned happened 50 years ago, and since then it has not been repeated. And Minato began to ask questions about monsters, to which the doctor replied that there are monsters, but there are very few of them and now is a calm time. Well, Minato thought that if this is true, then they have finally achieved peace. And now he took a deep breath because he was so happy that the attack was finally over. But the doctor continued to say that Minato is dead, and during the great disaster 50 years ago he sacrificed himself to save the world. So there is no way he can be that Minato guy who once fought against terrifying monsters. But Minato actually understood that at that time he really died, but now he has reincarnated into this guy. But the most important question is why this happened. And a few weeks later in one of the residential high-rise buildings, because he entered the apartment, he began to look at everything that was in this room. Names, I realized that this is the guy's room, that is, his. And immediately he began to study that guy and, having found the notebook, he realized that his parents died when he was still a child. But then he was adopted by other parents. But it soon turned out that his foster parents kicked him out and sent him to boarding school. But for another minute I noticed that this guy has since been living on the inheritance of his parents. But lying on the bed, our hero still realized that magical reincarnations do not exist. This means that his reincarnation was the work of God, or is it all just an accident? But suddenly he discovered a card in which it was written that the guy was a student at the Magic Academy, and that in his time there was no reason for its existence. And it seemed to him that everything would be interesting. But suddenly someone started calling Minato on the phone that was near his feet in the bag, and having taken it into his hands, He could not understand what to do with this thing, and he just sat and watched the phone vibrate in his hands. But suddenly Arthur, for no apparent reason, simply threw the phone behind his back. And as soon as the phone landed on the floor and hit it, it stopped ringing. And immediately after the call I received an SMS from Tanadu-kun, and it was written there that he heard that he had already been discharged from the hospital, and he could come to school. After all, he does not have enough money. And the very next day, Minato approached the main gate of the Magic Academy, and going inside the yard he saw many children wearing school uniforms. Well, Minato had too many emotions because he understood that going to school as an adult was so stressful. Of course, I was great and all that, but as soon as he saw a guy with a magic circle and flame magic, and the fact that he was trying at all his speed to destroy some kind of dummy with his stupidity, he couldn't understand what the hell was happening with magic, and what generally happens to their magical power. And at the same moment Minato began to look at all the students who were near him, and feeling the aura of everyone and their magical power, he suddenly became thoughtful. Holding his head in his hands, he didn't understand why this was such talking shit, and the fact that this is not true and this cannot be and their power is barely a tenth compared to the newcomers of his time, and can these guys even succeed as magicians? And yet Minato could not understand because he was simply intoxicated by reality, and this suggests that the magic had weakened so much. And wandering around the academy for a short time, he finally found his class 2A, and as soon as he entered the classroom, he began to look for a place where he could sit. And at the moment it was like he had a blast from the past because he was so excited and that he was wondering if he had friends here. But at the same moment, someone behind him began to walk up behind him with loud steps. And one of the three guys began to tell Minato how dare he ignore his message, even if he is just a pathetic Kusanagi. Well, as soon as he didn't have to turn his head to see who it was talking behind him, he immediately asked who he was. But that guy began to get angry and the veins on his forehead appeared from anger, and suddenly he hit the desk with his foot across the river. Minato was sitting and screamed how dare he forget him, and coming closer and closer to Minato, that guy began to insult him, calling him an insignificant piece of garbage. Minato suddenly began to remember that he met his friend who called him on the phone recently, and that guy, holding out his hand, began to say that he finally remembered and he knows what it means to be a friend. But Minato immediately stood up and began to shake the guy's hand and answer the question of what it means to get along well with each other. But that guy suddenly removed his hand and in loud words began to say no need, that he wasn't talking about that. For his clothes, that guy began to say that the money had run out and he should hurry up and give them his money because he had a lot left as an inheritance from his parents. Well, Minato was not a fool and realized that this guy whom he was reborn was being bullied by school bullies. But a second of silence led to the fact that that guy began to swing at our hero, shouting so that he would not be stupid. But the doors to the class opened and the girl coming inside began to say good morning to all the other guys. This girl was also sparkling, as if she was shining in her new uniform and excellent hairstyle. And at that very second the guy who wanted to hit our hero began to blush at the sight of that girl. And there is no need to say that they will definitely talk later. And as soon as they walked away and began to leave the classroom, Minato realized that they were complete fools. The lesson began and the teacher began to say that today's lesson topic is a great disaster, and the final tribulation is known as the Great Tribulation. Monsters began to appear all over the world and humanity fell into despair. But the discoverer of magic, the great sage Minato, thought differently, and the fact that he did not give up and defeated all the monsters himself, and finally he faced the boss of the disaster, the demon lord, whom he crushed and sacrificed his own life. From then on, the disaster never returned and the teacher immediately asked the students a question, who is, and with checks Minato and Jennifer began to raise her hand, and the teacher seeing this began to tell her that she could answer the question. And she began to say that the only survivor of the first disaster, and the first moss, and also the reason why the Komi Academy of Magic was built. And he was a world hero, and the idol of every magician. And the teacher replied that everything was correct. He was the only survivor of the first disaster, and also the first person to use magic, and the Academy of Magic was created to produce many magicians like him, and with Minato's checks he is the greatest mock in the history of mankind. Everyone's next test, but Minato, who was sitting at his desk, couldn't understand that if only it weren't necessary anymore, and he couldn't hear it because all of this embarrassed him so much. After all, He did not at all expect that he would be tortured like that, and that he should not have come to school. Well, everything is as the doctor said, peace has finally reigned on Earth, and because of this, the magic became weak. After all, no one fought against strong opponents to become stronger. And now Minato was very calm and he had never felt like this before. But as soon as the bell rang, the teacher, leading the class, began to tell the students that that was all for today and they could go, and tomorrow there would be an assessment of their magical power. But suddenly that guy came up to our hero again and started saying no need that he heard that tomorrow there will be an assessment of magical power, and it will be fun to see how shitty his magic is. But Minato still didn't understand why this guy is so stupid and when will he shut up, and now there's no point in lingering here. And as soon as he got up and began to leave, the guy said to Minato in the back that his parents also did not have magical powers and it was true that he was an orphan from childhood. And immediately after these words he began to laugh very loudly. But then Minato turned around and told him what a dumbass he was. That guy very angry and he started shouting that he would now bring him down from heaven to earth. And immediately he began to call upon a magic circle from which a huge flame appeared that scattered all the chairs and tables around the class. Well, the students who were watching this started screaming for him to calm down because he was really going to use magic in the class. Well, that guy didn't want to listen to anyone and continued to accumulate power. And at that very second he still used his magic and huge fire magic began to fly towards our hero, who stood in the same place and did not even think of evading. Well, that girl who saved that guy from a fight the first time ran again and screamed for Minato to be careful. But Minato simply didn't care. He looked at that huge ball and stood rooted to the spot. And at the same moment there was a huge explosion and the entire school class began to be on fire. But the girl immediately started screaming that he couldn't use magic because of a petty quarrel, and someone may suffer because of their squabbles. Well, the attacking guy started shouting that it was not his fault but that guy Minato, and he was the first to run into him. But all the guys looked at the dust that rose in the classroom, and as soon as it began to settle, the silhouette of a man was visible in the distance. But still, Minato stood there without a scratch on him. The guys who looked at him couldn't believe their eyes. After all, they thought that he had simply come to an end. But Minato, scratching his head, told the attacker that he had hit him. Well, those guys couldn't believe that he wasn't hurt after receiving his direct attack at point-blank range. But Minato began to think that he did not need to actively use magic and that he could easily protect himself from first-level magic with a simple magical barrier. And what he endured only because he was just a child. But looking at that guy, Minato decided that he urgently needs to be punished. And as soon as those guys looked at the terrifying expression on our hero's face, a frost crept through their skin, and getting seriously angry, our hero began to release enormous energy from his body, and a bright light appeared in the classroom, from which the children began to squint. And I don't understand what's happening and they couldn't move. And the fact that they did not understand at all what kind of magic this was and what was going on here. But Minato, in all seriousness, began to approach those guys who raised their tails at him. But as he came closer to that guy with red hair, Minato realized that he had already begun to cower from fear. And raising his hand, our hero already wanted to finish him off on the spot and teach him a good lesson. And at that moment he almost shit his pants because there was no way out to escape. But it all ended when the teacher came into the class and started asking what the noise was here, and who used magic in the classroom, and he is waiting for an explanation. But Minato exhaled deeply and began to speak to the teacher, that nothing was happening in the classroom, and maybe someone was using magic outside. But the teacher replied that there were no magic club classes in the yard. But Minato still continued to say that it was possible that some student used magic at his own discretion. After all, the teacher knows that wizards love to use their magic. But the teacher asked about the smoke that was in the class and Minato once again answered that it came from outside. And yet the teacher understood that since Kusagami said so, it means it's true. And after this conversation, the teacher began to tell the whole class that he was going to find the culprit. They should return to their places. But Minato waved his hand and thought that he had caused a lot of inconvenience, and he would probably need to create false evidence to close this case. Well, the students were in complete shock at what they had just glimpsed. Well, while all the students were confused, the guy with red hair was both annoyed and excited by what he had just seen. But Minato continued to think that even if they were just students, their level of magic was still too low, and would they be able to defeat the monster at all, even if the disaster was over, there were still monsters around, and that he should go and see what is happening there. And as soon as night fell, our hero set out on a journey to a city that was destroyed. And moving in the air in magic circles, he quickly wanted to get closer to the target and reconnoiter the situation, and landed on one of the buildings and looked out over the city. He realized that the city of Shibuya had changed a lot, and Minato decided that he had no need to stay here for long. He needed to continue on his way. And I continued my movement. He understood that he did not feel any monsters in the area and everything was in Ukraine. But it seems that the police took all the people out of here. But a little time later, I still felt the aura of monsters in the distance, as well as the aura of one person, and he decided to speed up before something terrible happened. But at this time the terrifying monster had already pressed the frightened girl against the wall, who began to tell him not to come near. But the monster simply didn't care and began to growl loudly and show his sharp teeth. But at that very second some mysterious guy appeared in front of the girl. But the monster was not frightened and he continued to fly straight at them with the goal of destroying them. And as soon as he approached the hero at arm's length, he immediately began to act. And a moment later the fight was over and the monster lay immobilized on the ground. And as soon as Minato turned around and looked at the girl, he saw that she was very frightened and that he arrived on time. After all, if he had been late by even a few minutes, she would have come to an end. But suddenly Minato noticed that the sign of the magic police was hanging on her chest. And turning around, he finally told her to be careful next time. But all the girl could say was thank you to the guy who saved her, and saw that he did not linger, and immediately summoned his magic circle and ran away. But she wondered who this guy was, and it looked like he was an outstanding magician. And now when she thinks about it, it seems to her that he didn't even cast any spells. But Minato, moving in the air, thought that it was good that he hid his face, and since he had just reincarnated, he didn't want to stand out. But to think that she could have been killed by a monster of such a low level, and that the level of the magic police had also dropped significantly. And apparently, people at this time are not able to defeat the monster. And not only students, but also the police, and the fact that the mages have weakened is a fact. And after thinking for a short time, Minato still smiled. After all, he began to understand that it seems that even in this era they need his strength. And in any case, he should destroy all the monsters in the area. And the next day a man standing near some machine began to say that today they would not measure their magical power, and they must make sure that they have received both the amount and the attribute, and this is the most important indicator for those who hope to become a professional magician. But Minato didn't understand. Couldn't he measure his strength without this thing? And the fact that even teachers do not know such basic things, and magical perception is the basis of magic. But suddenly his classmate approached Minato and began asking him if he could have a few words. And as soon as they stepped aside, the other guys noticed that Maria and Minato were talking to each other, and they didn't even know about Maria. But then Maria began to tell Minato that this was their first conversation and that she was the second daughter of the noble magical family of Metsuha. But Minato was a little lost because she was talking about some noble family of magicians. But Maria realized that he did not know what she was talking about, and began to tell that they were one of the main 4 noble houses of the leading magicians. And Minato realized that in his time there was nothing like this, and that he had never even heard of the Mizuha family. But after looking closely at her, our hero understood that her level of magical power is rather low and very weak for a girl coming from a family of outstanding magicians. But Maria couldn't understand what was wrong with this guy because she so generously started a conversation with him, and he should be grateful. A red-haired guy watched all this and looked closely at Minato, and he began to get angry because how dare he talk to Maria. But Minato began to ask Maria why he cares about the magical nobility. But Maria realized that this guy, the more he talks, the more he infuriates her. But Maria still decided to calm down and take a deep breath. And the fact that she is a noblewoman and should remember her dignity. But Minato did not understand what was wrong with this girl. But she was also worried about the fact that when Tadano hit him with magic yesterday, he remained unharmed. And there must be some reason for this. But as soon as Maria started talking about yesterday, the man standing behind her began to say that the remaining guys should be assessed. And Minato immediately moved from his place, saying that it was time to measure his magical power. But Maria already wanted to look at his strength, and stop living in guesses because of what happened yesterday. But the first one still approached Tadano and began to extend his hand, and as soon as he touched the magic stone, it began to glow, and the magic stone showed that his magic power was 1,000 points, and the fact that it belongs to the attribute of fire, and at the same moment Tadano saw it was incredibly happy because it was better than he could have imagined. But Minato, who was watching him, realized that if it was 1,000, then the standard of measurement had not changed in the last 50 years. And the next one who had to test her magic was Maria. And as soon as I touched it, a blue color appeared, and the magic crystal immediately began to show that her magic power was 2,000 points, and her attribute was water. Tadano, in which I watched her, realized that the two of them had the highest performance this year, and they have every chance of becoming excellent magicians, and the rest of the students standing nearby began to rejoice. After all, they expected fire magic from these prodigies, and the fact that Maria was so amazing. Our hero was in complete shock because he began to think that this was probably a joke and that she was only 2,000 and a little better than a beginner. Maria turned around and thought that she had surpassed Tadano, and that was the true power of the Medzuha house. But as soon as she looked at Minato, he immediately began to turn his head because he didn't understand why she had such a smug look, and she shouldn't look at him with that expression because it's unbearable. But the man immediately began to say that the next one who will measure his magical power will be Minato. But as soon as he began to approach the magic crystal, other guys began to whisper behind his back that they didn't fully know who he was and whether he was the one who had the worst results. Her grades in school are impressive, but his talent for magic is disgusting. But Tadano, who watched this, thought that Minato was simply a moron. He had no talents, and now he would simply disgrace himself in front of Maria. But the girl Maria was finally waiting for him to show them how much magical power he has. But he definitely won't surpass her. And as soon as everything was ready, Minato began to stretch out his hand to the magic crystal. But still Minato didn't understand what to do. After all, at one time he stood out too much, and it was very stressful to attract a lot of attention to himself. And maybe he can restrain himself a little now, but although it doesn't matter anymore. And as soon as he touched the magic stone, everyone standing behind him held their breath. And at the same moment the magic stone began to glow with rainbow colors. Every second the magical stone glowed brighter and brighter. But Minato decided that he would give it his all and let everyone see what he was capable of, and that if it can change his power as a great sage, then he will start. But immediately after that, the entire magical school began to glow with a bright light, and all the students who were sitting at their study desks began to notice something, and those students, even who were lying on a bench on the street, began to explode from their seats. Maria, who was watching our hero, could not understand what was happening, and the magic counter that was installed on the stone began to spin like crazy. Due to the enormous power that Minato poured into the stone, it began to crack, and all this magical power began to be released and fly into the sky, covering the entire magical school. And eventually the magic stone exploded and began to fly into different pieces, and the guys standing behind began to cover their faces with their hands because a huge magical force began to press on them. But after this, huge pieces of magic stone flew straight towards the other students. But suddenly a barrier appeared in front of their face that held back the fragments of the magic stone. Well, Minato couldn't understand that the magic stone broke after he became a little more serious, and the fact that no one here could feel his magical power. And are these guys really capable of becoming magicians, he wondered. But the teacher began to approach the children and ask if anyone was hurt, but they answered that everything was fine, and went up to the cops. He asked if everything was okay. But the same one answered that he was lucky, even though he ended up in the very epicenter, so everything was fine. But for the first time, the teacher saw the measuring device break down, and perhaps there was some kind of defect in it. And for him it was not good because now they will not be able to find out the current magical power of the Minata and its attribute. Well, our hero didn't understand. Is this really a problem? But the teacher began to explain that they planned to divide the students into groups for practical classes, and they wanted to decide on the groups after they saw the results, and the teacher immediately began asking Tadano that Kusanagi if they would accept him into their team, to which he began to look at his friends and smile strangely, and he immediately answered the sensei that they would of course accept him into their team, to which the teacher thanked him. But Tadano approached Minato and began to tell him that he was looking forward to this moment. The next day in the destroyed Shibuya Old Town, monsters still inhabited places that had been badly damaged during the Great Disaster. Shibuya is currently abandoned by magicians and the police regularly exterminate the monsters living here. And also the students of the academy should help them in this. And since more than half of the monsters have already been destroyed by professional magicians, they should not worry too much. But Minato, standing next to the teacher, suddenly thought that it was a practical lesson, and it was unexpected. But even students should be able to destroy a couple of monsters. In the end they will work in groups. And turning around, Minato realized that he was here last night, but it was somehow strange. After all, he was sure that he had destroyed all the monsters, but he still feels some. And the fact that there are no signs of disaster here. But he didn't understand why monsters appear here. But the girls who stood behind him began to say that they would compete, and today they would definitely not lose. But I didn't understand why they were so careless even though they were in real danger. But Maria, who was standing nearby, suddenly began to look at our hero, who sighed from the fact that he realized that his Anoklasniki were ordinary dumbass. But the teacher began to call all the students and say that classes were almost starting and they must definitely work as a group. And as soon as the teacher walked away he started calling Minato, and after a moment he pressed him against the wall, and began to show off in front of his friends and tell our hero that now no one will bother them. But Minato realized that it seemed he was too kind and this time he would not be so gentle, and began to tell that guy Tadano that if he didn't like him, then he could simply ignore him. But Tadano suddenly screamed that words weren't allowed to be trash. And the fact that he forgot who is trash here and why Maria was so interested in him. But Minato couldn't understand what he was saying. Did he just move his head? Dawned on him, and he realized that it was all because he liked Maria. And Tadano, after hearing what he heard, began to get angry to such an extent that he could hardly restrain his emotions. But suddenly Minato noticed something strange, as if someone was approaching them. And at that same second Tadano began to cast a spell and prepare a magic circle to attack Minato with fire. But Minato began to tell him not to do this, to which the classmate replied that now it was too late to apologize, and our hero told him to turn around. But Tadano said that he couldn't be fooled by such childish tricks. But he felt something strange and still turned his head. And suddenly they saw a terrible monster standing behind them. But the guys had already begun to cower from fear because they didn't understand where it came from. And in general, this is impossible. And why he ended up in this particular place. And she also looks like he was very strong. And the fact that this monster was also a demonic soldier. The frightened guys began to ask Tadano if he could defeat him. But he replied that of course he could, because for him it was bullshit. And summoning his fire magic circle again, he began to cast a spell. And as soon as his magic circle gained enough magical power, he began to attack the monster with fire magic. And considering that the work was finally finished, the guys were pleased that they had defeated the enemy. But still they rejoiced early because the monster remained alive. And when the guys saw this they realized that they couldn't even scratch him. But Minato understood that the demonic soldier could not be destroyed by his low-level magic. And as soon as the monster took a few steps, the guys were horrified. After all, they had never seen such a terrifying monster in front of them, and now they were simply cowards, like small puppies. And having fallen to earth, they could no longer escape anywhere and watched as the monster gradually approached them. But the guys started crying very loudly because they didn't understand that they would die here. Because of fear, they even wet their pants. But as soon as the monster swung and was ready to finish off those guys, he felt something, some unknown force standing near him. And raising his eyes, he saw a guy standing nearby. Well, Minato was so calm that the monster, who looked into his eyes, suddenly saw a future in which this guy would simply destroy him. And at that very moment he jumped back because he realized that now he himself, the terrifying demon soldier, could die. And passing by the cowardly classmates lying on the ground, Minato said that apparently even a demonic soldier is capable of speaking. Who is the strongest of all those here? The monster continued to be wary of our hero and stood nearby without moving. But as soon as Minato began to radiate his enormous power, the hand of the huge monster suddenly moved. And at that very moment the monster seemed to go crazy and began to growl at the entire area, also emitting enormous strength and power and calling on his magic circles. But Minato at the same moment wanted to check who was stronger than that monster with his 2 magic circles, or he with his 1. But the cowardly classmates lying behind Minato began to tell him that he would not be able to defeat this creature of first-level magic, and they would all die. But the monster began to release a second-level crushing stone that flew straight towards Minato. But our hero simply blocked his attack with his barrier. But immediately after this, the monster began to use the first level of fire arrow. A bright explosion covered the entire area. And what happened in the end was that the monster saw that his attack was simply pointless. But Minato stood in the same place and didn't move a centimeter, even though the guys sitting behind him couldn't look at this huge explosion normally. But as soon as the explosion ended, with a little fear on their faces, the guys still began to see something ahead of them. And all that was left of that monster, and the wet date was that he melted into pieces. And the guys couldn't believe what just happened, and the fact that Minato killed that demonic soldier. And the fact that this is simply impossible, because someone like Minato can do this. But our hero, leaving, answered those guys that, unlike him, his first-level magic was capable of killing a demonic soldier. But still, Minato thought that everything was somehow strange that the demonic soldier ended up in Shibuya. After all, yesterday he killed all the monsters, but they appeared again, and this is very strange. And the fact that this is an omen of disaster, and the situation is more serious than he expected. And what he had already seen before, how terrifying monsters killed all people indiscriminately, and without any regret when little girls or boys watched some things they killed, and how the greatest mages lost their friends, comrades and relatives. And thinking about all this, Minato suddenly became sad, and clenching his fist he decided that even if disaster happens again, he will save everyone. Well, the guys who were behind our hero couldn't believe that he defeated the soldier, and was it really Minato? And getting very angry, Tadano hit the wall with all his strength with his fist. After all, he couldn't believe that a guy like Minato could wield such terrifying power. But they could not even guess that Maria was watching this whole battle, hiding around the corner. But a little earlier, Maria killed the monster with the help of her water discs, which simply cut it into pieces. And her team watching her looked in surprise at what was happening because they did not expect anything else from their partner. But Maria couldn't understand how anyone could be surprised at such a level, and she was worried that they were such ordinary people. But now there's nothing to be done. She has such talent. But suddenly Maria saw her classmates who were taking Minato aside, and something was explained to him in the distance in a rude tone. But at the same moment Maria told her comrades that she would go away for a minute, and as soon as they turned the corner, she saw that those guys were mocking Minato, and if that was the case, then she couldn't let them get away with it. But as soon as she ran to the corner of the building and looked behind it, she saw something that she did not expect to see in this same place: how the monster stood next to the guys. But she began to remember that she had already seen this monster somewhere, and suddenly she remembered the books that the teacher gave her and the fact that it was the Devil's Guardian. This is not the monster that they can defeat, and Maria still decided, clenching her fist, that they need help and that she is a person from the Mizuha clan and cannot leave everything just like that. And as soon as she ran around the corner and started moving towards that monster, screaming for them to run away, she saw a bright light after which an explosion appeared. And covering her face, she could not understand what happened and who was able to attack so strongly. But as soon as the fire wave passed, she saw that in the place where the monster stood, everything was burning with a red flame and the monster disappeared. And the one who destroyed him was Minato, who stood with his outstretched hand. And Maria couldn't understand what it was, and could it really be Minato's magic? And as far as she remembers, he was timid and had no inclinations for magic. But now he is completely like a different person, and she didn't hear him reciting spells, and really he simply didn't read them and was able to use magic. And in general she couldn't believe that he defeated the guard of the first rank, and the level of power of the monster is determined by the number of crystals it has, and its place in the hierarchy is already established based on it. And in 6th place are magical beasts with 1 stone, and in 5th place were the magical guards with 2 stones. And in 4th place are demons with 3 magic crystals. In 3rd place are the supreme demons with 4 stones. In 2nd place are demons with 5 stones. And in 1st place is the devil or Satan. Each creature has a fixed number of active ranks, and this is something that all modern magicians should know. In order to defeat a guard, you must have at least the 3rd rank, and with the 1st it should be impossible. And while thinking, Maria noticed that Minato began to move towards her. But Maria suddenly wondered why she was hiding at all. And as soon as Minato passed by her, she suddenly decided to hide even deeper. But our hero was very attentive, and when leaving she began to say that it was a good hobby for her to peep. And I start to come out from around the corner. Maria suddenly asked our hero how he knew that she was here. But Minato replied that it would be strange if the magician did not notice this. And as soon as he looked at her, he soon realized that after all, he was right. The fact that she really cannot sense magical power. And immediately our hero turned around and began to walk away in a different direction. But then Maria started shouting at his back to tell him to wait. After all, she wanted to know what his words meant and he should explain to her. But as soon as she ran around the corner behind Minato, she couldn't understand where he had disappeared because literally a few seconds had passed. And our hero was right above her, standing on the building and watching Maria search for him, but thinking about whether he should check the area for monsters. And as soon as he concentrated, he realized that there were no more guards nearby, but there were a decent number of magical beasts. And the fact that he doubts that the other students will cope with them if Tadano's level is considered excellent, then their number will be reduced at least a little in this area around the Shibuya station. But still he made his decision, and stretching out his two hands in different directions, he began to call upon magic circles. And as soon as the spell was ready, Minato was ready. Apply the second rank of magic projectiles that began to fly out of the magic circles on his hand. And at the same moment, magical projectiles began to fly straight over the entire city. And our hero's classmates noticed this. But some were dull and thought that these were meteorites. But other students who were a little smarter said that it was. And Maria, who was below and was looking for Minato, also noticed that it was the magic that flew over her that she was struck by such an amount. But at this time many demonic beasts surrounded the schoolchildren, and they realized that they could no longer cope. And as soon as one of the demonic beasts attacked the girl standing in front of him, and she had already said goodbye to her life because she saw how huge and sharp teeth were right next to her head. But the magic projectile that appeared near her destroyed the monster, and when she came to her senses, the girl could not understand what had happened, because she saw only a bright light in front of her eyes. But at this time Minato continued to stand on the tallest building in the city, and watch as his shells flew straight to the target, and, according to his feelings, everything was moving as it should. And I watched as his shells simply killed all the monsters to smithereens. He suddenly began to feel nervous because of what he suddenly realized. That after all, maybe he overdid it because he killed all the monsters that were in the nearest areas. And as soon as the last monster died from his projectile, he grabbed his head and realized for sure that he had finished off almost all the monsters at once. And the fact that this was already implied as a lesson, and he still should have reduced his strength. And looking around, Minato realized that he could finally get down from this building. After all, there was no one nearby for anyone to see him. And with the help of his magic circles, which he placed at his feet, he was able to be on Earth literally in 1 second. And he realized that there is no need to hide his strength to the extreme. But if it attracts attention, it will cause some inconvenience. And after wandering around the alleys a little, he still found a group of classmates, and a teacher who was standing near the deceased demonic beast. And the teacher began to say that he did not know that there were so many magical animals left here, and the herd had to be broken before the students arrived. And the fact that he noticed something strange was that the demonic beast died from one blow, and this work was clearly a person of proper skill. And the fact that this is magic without the use of elements, magic without elements, and such an innumerable number of projectiles. And he had never had to deal with this. And the fact that without this magic they would still be in serious danger. And the fact that there are 2 creatures is not a problem, but to resist 6, he is afraid that the students would not be able to cope with them. But the students were confused about why there were so many magical beasts here and the fact that they almost died. And the teacher turned around and began to ask for forgiveness from the students, and explained to them that they heard that the killing of the herd should have been dealt with by the academy police. It would be worth making sure of this. And he is really very sorry that he put the students in danger. But one of the students began to ask the teacher who saved them. Well, the teacher replied that he didn't know, but the students simply wanted to thank him. But the teacher immediately thought that it was unlikely that it was someone from the police or official magicians, and it was possible that it was an outlaw magician. But the fact remains that he saved them, and the unknown magician can only be thanked. But that unknown magician was Minato, standing next to the teacher. And a little later, when everyone had calmed down, the girls began to whisper whether the others had seen the Tamagia and what it was all about. But Minato continued to think that it seemed like no one was hurt, and even those stupid people who stood behind him and looked at him angrily. But the only one who guessed was Maria that Minato killed the guard of the first rank and, in addition, a huge amount of magic. The fact that it is his doing the magic of the fire element, as well as magic without their use. And now there are no students possessing two elements, and not even this person. But still, she changed her mind and decided that these were just guesses. After all, he could not possibly possess two elements, and someone else used magic without elements. But the fact that he defeated the guard is a fact, and she still wondered who this Minato was. But the other guys started discussing that those things looked like lasers and Minato must have done it. But the other guy said that this couldn't be, to which he was told that he had killed the guard. But Tadano suddenly with an angry face began to tell the guys to shut up or else he would finish him off. And those guys started looking at him with stupid looks. After all, it can't be that the worthless sociopath Minato is strong, and in any case there's something wrong here. And those guys, out of fear, immediately began to agree with the words Tadano is that this is really strange, not that he is doing something wrong. And the fact that Minato is playing a dishonest game, and the fact that he turned his nose up and he will rip off his mask. And after classes, Minato began to leave the Magic Academy. But suddenly he stopped and saw that many guys were approaching him and asking whether he was really waiting for them. And at the head of those guys was Tadano, who with a stupid expression on his face began to approach our hero. And he, in turn, began to say that again they were an annoying group and didn't they think that it would be better for them to practice magic. But Tadano, in response, began to shout to our hero that he was talking too much for a scoundrel. But no, I couldn't understand what this man meant. And Tadano continued to tell him not to pretend because he wouldn't believe that he could use one of mine, and he must admit what kind of trick he used there. But after exhaling deeply, Minato still realized that there was no point in trying to talk to them. Tadano immediately began to turn around and walk towards his comrades. After all, he thought that he could defeat our hero with numbers. But Minato was not the type to be cowardly and began to tell the guys that there was no need for disaster. But these words struck a chord with Tadano, and he began to shout towards our hero so that he would not pretend that he could do whatever he wanted. And running up to the minute, he was ready to strike him with his fist, shouting that magic was useless in a fight. And as soon as he ran up, he hit Minato straight in the face. And immediately after that, other guys joined in and began waving their fists and legs and beating Minato. And while they were beating him, Tadano began to say that without magic he could not do anything. And he may not even try to apologize because he will finish him off anyway. And Minato stood in the same place and realized that everything was like a wall, and the fact that his magic is activated automatically. So even though they wave their fists all night, they still won't be able to inflict a single wound. And the fact that there are so many problems with them, and our hero thought, maybe he can pretend that they hit him at least once. Because he was so bored that he decided that he would sit down while those fools waved their fists. But at the same moment, Maria's voice was heard, who began to ask what they were doing here. But those guys did not expect that she would appear here and, turning around and not with a strange expression on their faces, began to look at her. Tadano immediately began to say that there was nothing like that. They were just having fun. But Maria knew that they were mocking Minato. And speaking of the fact that somewhere you hear that students of the Academy of Magic are doing this, and aren't they ashamed? But that guy was very ashamed after Maria's words. And they began to think that all this was because of that Minato, and who would say that it was not his fault? Maria was outraged by him. And as soon as she approached the cops and took his hand, she began to say that they were leaving now. But as soon as Tadano saw that they held hands, began to get angry. So he had never been so angry in his life, and all he muttered under his breath was that it was all because of Minato. And at the same moment he stood up and began shouting that it was all because of Minato, and reciting a spell. Well, when our hero left, he realized what had begun. And those guys definitely won't calm down, and the enraged Tadano began shouting to his friends to destroy him. But Maria, as soon as she heard their words, turned around and began asking what he was going to do. But those guys could not be stopped, and together they began to use their magic circles and summon fireballs. But Maria, no matter how hard she tried, wanted to protect them both and began to use her magic. but it was too late. After all, their attack had almost reached the target, and Maria and Minato, standing still, saw how a huge fire was flying at them, covering her face. Maria wanted to somehow avoid such an attack, and as soon as it was over, Tanadu began to say that after this it would be impossible to cheat. But the guys who stood behind him began to think that, seriously, was it a good idea? Because he really was dead. But Tanadu told them that they were simply idiots and had nothing to fear. I can't say that they just accidentally used magic outside of school and it got out of control and Minato just fell into the hands. But suddenly those guys heard Minato's voice and he said that their foolishness had gone beyond all limits. And before he did not attach any importance to this because he regarded it as childish behavior. But apparently now the stubborn ones will be corrected by a club, said our hero. After all, the time has come to raise stupid children. But the guys, in turn, could not believe their eyes that he survived and after such a volume of magic. Well, Minato didn't want to listen to them and began to raise his hand to attack them back. But in the end he decided to tell the fools that they had endangered not only him, but also Maria and how blind he was with his thirst for revenge. Tanadu suddenly began to tell our hero that it was all his fault, and there was no point in looking down on him, and he will extinguish it as long as it takes to destroy it. And Minato, without further ado, began to raise his hand and point his index finger to the sky, and a small magic circle appeared on the tip of his finger. But the guys, as soon as they saw this, began to laugh loudly and ask him what kind of magic circle this was, and the fact that this time he would definitely die, and they began to use their magic again and attack Minato along with Maria. And before they had time to finish attacking, our hero activated his magic with 2 words, magical source, and huge vines began to appear from his magic circle, who rushed straight at those guys. And as soon as the vines tied them up, they could not understand what was happening and why they could not move. It didn't work out. So the magical vines simply sucked the life force out of them, and those guys began to fall asleep. And all this magical power simply returned back to the magic circle. And as soon as Minato finished, those guys lay exhausted on the earth. But our hero approached them and looked at them. He couldn't understand. He only sucked out a little magic and it had already dried up. But now he hopes that they will think a little. But Maria didn't understand what kind of magic this was and what happened and why those guys fainted. And at the same moment Minato was about to leave as soon as he realized that he had finished everything. But Maria began to say that he shouldn't wait at least a minute, and she began to ask Minato what kind of magic it was and what it did, and he almost didn't own mine, did he? And who he is anyway, because now she doesn't recognize the old man. But with a heavy sigh, Minato realized that it would be very troublesome, and leaving our hero asked her that she shouldn't have said something different. But with all the embarrassment she still thanked him for saving her, and as soon as she raised her head and was ready to hear answers to the questions, she suddenly saw that Minato was missing, and with anger and embarrassment on her face, she could not understand where he had gone all this time. Well, as soon as night fell, Minato, having changed clothes and hiding his face, continued to explore the city, and landing on one of the houses, he began to look at the surrounding areas, and as soon as he began to concentrate, he realized that he had a bad feeling, so he came to find out. But apparently the monsters that were supposed to be exterminated during the day were resurrected again. But he did not understand why this was happening. If this is the case only with Shibuya, he alone will be enough. Only now he senses my monsters existing in other places. And it's possible that the police simply can't keep up. And the level of magicians doesn't seem to be high. And be that as it may, it would be impossible for him to remove demons in all of Japan alone. But still he did not understand what to do. He needs to take some measures. But for now he will focus on clearing the area in the area. He needs to act carefully without attracting attention, and continuing to destroy monsters. He moved in the air very carefully and unnoticed. But at that time, not far from our hero, a man was walking late at night from a party and he got completely drunk. But he could not even imagine that a monster was now quietly creeping up behind him. Only that huge monster opened its big mouth, and with its sharp teeth they already want to finish off that drunken man. Minato appeared and, with the help of his magical power, threw the monsters aside. And the man, noticing something strange behind him, began to slowly turn his head. But still he didn't see anything and thought that he was just imagining things. But in fact, the monster and our hero were around the corner. and he simply began to continue walking home. Names, I couldn't even guess that the ordinary guy was filming him on his phone at the same time, and immediately posted a video about a magician in a black suit who saved a man on the internet. The next day, the guys gathered in the director's office, who was sitting at his desk and their teacher was standing next to him. And the teacher began to say that the students of their school used magic outside the school and they received such a message yesterday. And if this is true, then they cannot leave this issue unattended. And they must now explain the situation, whatever it may be. But Tanadu immediately started screaming and pointing with his index finger at Minato that they did not use magic and that it was Minato who started the fight. Well, our hero couldn't understand how this dumbass could lie so easily, and he even admired it. And the fact that it's not possible to remain silent here and there's still a lesson. But there's nothing left to do except explain to the teacher everything as it is. And just for a second Minato said that all the words that guy said were lies. And Mary, standing next to them, gathered her thoughts and determination, and began to say that Tadano and his friends mocked Minato and they were the ones who started using magic. But the teacher did not fully understand her words and asked again about what they had started, and that is, Minato also used magic. And Maria immediately began to answer the teacher that it was self-defense, and he didn't do anything wrong. But Minato was surprised by Maria's words, and as soon as Tanadu began to interrupt Maria, she immediately told him to shut his mouth. And the fact that this is unthinkable, and not only was he mocking, he also dares to shift responsibility to another, and he is not the least bit ashamed as an academy student. Tanadu immediately began to answer Maria that no one at all suits Minato for this academy, and therefore he proposes his exclusion. Maria, hearing these words, said that the one who does not correspond to the academy is him. But that guy still stood his ground and said that he seemed to have the best results in the entire course, and he is the only one who can stand on a par with Maria, but not Minato. And what is this conversation about? And Maria should think soberly. A guy like him won't save her, and she should look at him and become his girlfriend. But such words were so stupid that Maria simply replied to let him dream further. Tanadu did not expect such an answer and was simply plunged into shock. Maria continued to say that she would never become the girlfriend of a man who enjoys bullying, a person who is prone to cruelty, and even more so a person who chooses a completely inappropriate moment for confession. And Minato, who was watching this stupid situation, realized that what comes around is what you get. But this situation definitely evokes pity, and at the same moment the director told the teacher that it seemed that the fault lay with Tanadu and his friends. But Minato used magic for self-defense, and they don't need people who use magic for selfish reasons. So he excludes them. But then the Tornado's friends began to tell the teacher and director that they were simply obeying his instructions. Teach immediately began to tell Minato and Maria that they could already go, and as soon as they left the office, Maria was furious and began to say that it was really low, and that she had not experienced such indignation for a long time. But Minato became interested in what would happen to them when they were expelled, and Maria replied that they would no longer become magicians, and for guys like them this is natural. Immediately Maria began to ask Minato how it was possible to remain silent after everything that was said to her. But Minato answered her that he was going to speak, but then she spoke. And suddenly Minato thought about something important, and Maria noticed this and began to ask what was the matter. What she wanted was that the idea suddenly came to Minute, but this was not the first time she tried to help him out. And then in class and during classes on a Rio battle and now, and she is so amazingly good. But as soon as Maria heard these words, she immediately began to feel embarrassed, and her face began to turn red. Well, turning around, she began to tell Minato not to say such things and she would go forward. But Minato, who stood and watched her, began to understand. The fact that Kusanagi Minato died and he was reborn, and did that last guy decide to die because of bullying? Or it really was an ordinary car accident, and he won't know for sure. But now they have suffered their punishment, and has at least some kind of retribution been accomplished. But at the same time, two guys stood near the director of the Magic Academy and began to say, what does it mean that there are students who used magic outside the academy, as well as students who were involved? And the director replied that everything was correct. And fortunately, no civilians were hurt, but the guys didn't understand why they were called. And the director responded that one of the students involved was Mizuka Maria. And immediately the girl turned around and said that she understood the state of affairs and she thanks the director for the report. But the director finally asked the girl to say hello to their father, but she replied that the director should be calm because her father is interested in investing for the academy. And the guy standing next to the girl began to tell her that if now they found out the truth and this Minato has quite a lot of strength, then fighting with some magicians is an extremely thankless task. If you don't have much impressive strength, then you won't win. But the guy still couldn't understand if she really wanted to say that he was stronger in comparison with them. But the girl replied that this was not so, but she was interested in him. And the fact that they will now do this will confirm this, the power level of that student Kusanagi Minato. And she also wants to resolve the issue with her sister whether she will leave the educational institution or not. And for the guy Katsuragi Ruji it sounded interesting. But a little later, Minato was lying on his desk in his class and thinking about how the constancy of peace in the whole world is so unstable. Behind him, the guys began to discuss a video they had recently watched about how this magician in black is very cool. But Minato, hearing these words about the magician in black, began to wonder if this was someone from the magical aristocracy. But now he doesn't care anymore because he doesn't even want to delve into it. Friend teacher walked up to the entrance to the classroom and began waving his hand at Minato so that he would pay attention to him. And as soon as he gathered the students, he began to say that the students who could not pass the assessment of magical power would now be reassessed. And Minato realized that they had finally fixed what was standing behind Maria. Realized that she would finally find out how his real strength was Minato. But as soon as they entered the room, Maria suddenly saw her sister who stood with a guy near a magic crystal, and she began to ask why she came to such a place. And why did she even come to such a place, and does she really need to observe the re-evaluation? And the fact that my sister really came to look at Minato, and really she also considers his strength suspicious. And as soon as the next turn was Minato, he approached the magic stone and the assessment of magical power immediately began. But he understood that last time he broke everything. So now he needs to watch his strength. And touching the magic stone, his hand began to emit magical power that the stone absorbed. And concentrating completely, he began to concentrate his strength as much as possible. But the counter began to strangely show homological strength. And after that, he exhaled with difficulty that he had finally been able to learn and began to ask if he was okay. And the fact that finally this time the assessment was a success. But there was still something incomprehensible. And the fact that Minato's elements are that he simply doesn't have them, and they are missing. The other guys started looking at the amount of his magic. And the counter showed 100. But the guys who saw it started talking about it. That this is the worst indicator on the course and it is very rare that there are no elements at all. But judging by the rumors, in principle, he does not just come to her. And the guy who came with Maria's sister began to say that it was really he who defeated the gang and apparently there was some kind of misunderstanding. But Ruka first tell her comrade that they are leaving because the case is closed. And the other guys simply mocked Minato that he was so tired of some kind of assessment. And apparently this is a common thing for what was such a level of magic. But the teacher approached Minato and began to tell him not to attach much importance to this, because the amount of magic is not the whole picture. But Maria understood that this was certainly strange and Minato's real strength was such that he was able to cope with the magical guard and he must have elemental magic as well as non-elemental magic. But she had not heard that the amount of magic could be regulated, and how did it even happen to him? Minato, wiping away the sweat from the fact that he had tensed up so much, finally exhaled. After all, the result he had just worked so hard on came out flawless, and the fact that the magic power needed to be adjusted as accurately as possible, and it turned out to be very tedious, but the trick worked. And this is the most important thing. As soon as the magical test was over, he walked along the corridor with Maria and he began to ask Maria that she was also at her father's night point. But she replied that she was interested in something. But two high school students who stood in their way began to tell Maria and Minato to stop. And looking up they saw Mary's sister and some guy. Minato immediately started asking who they were. But the girl began to answer that she is the eldest daughter of the Mizuha family. Her name is Ruka. And the guy who is standing next to her is Ruji and they are both in their 3rd year of study. Minato immediately realized that they were from the same family along with Maria and began to ask what business they came up with. But Maria's sister, starting to walk, said that there was no one to see him anymore. And at that very second Maria began to shake with fear as soon as she saw that her sister began to walk towards her. and immediately she asked Mary that she could not do anything against the criminals. And besides, she heard a lot about the fact that she was saved by this young man whose strength is equal to some 100, and is this true? But Maria, who lowered her head, said that it was all true. And at that same second, Maria's sister began to say in a rude tone that in studies and sports, and in magic she is inferior to her in all sorts of spheres. If this is so, then she can simply leave the academy. And at the same moment Maria thought, and remembered that her sister was always better in everything. And then when they fought in sparring, she won. And then when they used their magical power and competed, Maria did not understand why her magic was not as strong as her sister's, and the fact that she had never been able to defeat her. Maria's sister continued to say that she was not good at magic, and if she was the only one left from their family, that would be enough. But Maria still wanted to tell her that she was not a weakling. But her sister didn't even let her say a word, or said that she had better listen to what she was telling her, that she should leave the academy and start attending a regular school. And without realizing it, Maria agreed with her sister's words that she should leave the magic school. But still Maria, clenching her fist, wanted to say something to her sister. But suddenly Minato, who was standing nearby, jumped into the conversation and told Sister Maria that she was very arrogant. But she immediately began to turn her head around and ask Minato what he just said. And our hero said that they conduct a non-stop monologue, not allowing the interlocutor to express this, and this is nothing more than arrogance. But Maria's sister told Minato that this was a family conversation and the word was not given to a stranger. But Minato replied that it really was a conversation because it sounded like an order to him. Well, these words really angered Maria's sister. But Minato continued to say that she should not impose her way of life and there are no reasonable grounds for this, even if they are family members. But she replied that a reasonable person would just stop the pipe dream. And her sister doesn't have the talent for mine, and she never achieved her defeat. But at that same moment, tears appeared in Maria's eyes and she realized that her sister was right and that she had no talent. And remembers those moments in life when she told herself that she was talented, and she has the necessary qualities. She tried to convince herself of this. Even though I myself have never won against my sister. But our hero was not sure about this and immediately said that she would win. But Maria immediately noticed that as soon as Minato said this, he smiled. But her sister was not sure about this. And of course not right here and now, Minato answered. But then Maria's sister began to suggest that it should be held in 2 weeks as a 2-on-2 duel. Well, Minato started smiling after hearing about duels. But Mary's sister continued to say that after all these insolences, was he really thinking of running away? And with confident words, our hero still answered that he was not afraid and that he was also participating. But turning to Mary, he asked what she would do, but she was shocked by what just happened and until the end she was not sure to answer her yes or no. But still she realized that she was very strong, she just needed to practice a little and said that she was also participating. And when I hear these words, Minato was happy about this and said that they decided, and that if they win, they should no longer interfere in anything other than their own business. But Sister Maria said that if they win, then Maria will leave the academy. And when leaving, Sister Maria said lastly, at best. And a little time later, Maria began to tell Minato that she had a request for him, that she wants him to become her magic mentor. But Minato couldn't understand that he was suddenly called to the roof, and this is what he gets. And the fact that he is a lone magician and his magic power is 100 and she asks such a person to become her mentor. But Maria immediately replied that he was hiding his strength, and she had no doubt that he should be stronger even than her. And Minato couldn't imagine that she still realized that he was very strong. Maria continued to say that he knows how to become stronger, which is why he talked about defeating her sister. But Minato began to think that this type of person like her always sees everything as black or white. So she provoked him to fight, and now he doesn't even know what to say to her. But at that very moment she began to bow to him, and very strongly asked him to agree, and exhaled deeply. He still agreed to teach her, but not expecting him to agree, she suddenly raised her head and asked the truth about what he just said. But he replied that, however, provided that she follows what he says and does not run away halfway. After all, he couldn't refuse when they asked so much. And the fact is that what awaits them and the fact that it wouldn't be superfluous to help with magic and Minato decided. And what he also said was that they would start right today. But still he still didn't know what place to assign. But Maria suggested to him that they could go to her house. Well, as soon as they decided, A few hours later they got to Maria's house and stood on the training ground, and as soon as Maria changed clothes, Minato looked back and began to tell her that he didn't think that she had such a huge house, but she replied that her father was one of the magical aristocrats. So this goes without saying, and while warming up, Maria still realized that she was bringing home a boy for the first time, and the fact that it looks strange from the outside, although there is nothing particularly strange about it. But as soon as Minato told Maria that it was time for them to start, she turned around and started asking why he was calling her by name, but our hero replied that her sister's name is also Mizuka. So it will be unclear who he means, and she immediately understood what was going on. But Minato said that if she didn't like that, then he could call her differently. But she still answered that she didn't mind, and at the same moment Minato said that he wouldn't start then, and he hoped for her help. And first of all, she must answer the questions about what magic power is. Maria thought that it was very simple and began to say that this is the internal energy of the body necessary to handle mine. And the next question was about the spell, and she again began to answer that it was a program that automatically turns magical power into magic, and the next question is whether it is then possible to increase magical power with the help of intention. To which she replied that it is impossible, that the limit on the amount of magical power is determined from birth and at a certain age its growth stops. And having answered all the questions, she began to say that this is a perfect answer, isn't it? Said with a serious expression that all the answers were wrong. But Maria could not believe her own ears. Minato could not understand whether modern mages were really so ignorant, and what had happened in these 50 years. And he began to explain that firstly, magical power exists not only in the body but also in nature. In any case, the spell has an auxiliary function, and an increase in magical power with the help of intention is possible. But Maria immediately began to answer that this cannot be, and if this were all true, the science of magic would be turned upside down. Minato, in turn, answered that now she may not believe him, but in any case, he will explain to her the 3 questions that they just talked about, and she should now sit down, and he began to show that now she should let the magical power flow, and how she felt it, she should say about it. But she didn't understand whether it was possible to feel her at all. Minato replied that if she couldn't, then she wouldn't become stronger, and as soon as she closed her eyes, Minato touched her back, and at the same moment, magical energy began to leave their bodies. But still, our hero realized that this was not enough and began to put more effort, and as soon as a sufficient amount of magical energy was released, Minato asked if she felt, to which the answer was heard that her back became hot, and she felt something. This was the perception of magic, said Minato, and Maria immediately began to tell Minato that this is what he was talking about before. This is what he meant by the feeling of magic, and Minato told her not to forget about this perception. After all, if she can feel, then she will be able to identify and see the magical power of natural objects. The first thing she should strive for is this. But she replied that she was the second daughter of the Mizuha family, and she would definitely cope with this quickly. But Minato thought about what happened after a decent flow of magical power, and it seems that Maria has no talent for magic. And after a week of hard training they met again at the training grounds near Maria's house. Maria began to cry and say that she couldn't do anything at all. But Minato thought about the fact that a whole week of serious practice had passed, and she still hadn't figured out the basics. And at the same time, everyone will soon have a duel, and tell her once again that he will direct the magical flow for the last time. And as soon as he reached her back, he began to release magical power again, and tell Mary to open her eyes. And at that very moment she finally began to see magical power, and very happy because she finally saw the magic. And looking at her hands she realized that it was very cool, and she couldn't believe that she could see Manu, and the fact that now she will probably be able to see it in Minato. And turning around she saw that she was almost invisible, and she wondered why. But at the same moment Minato began to say that she did well and did a good job. But Maria replied that it was nothing special because it goes without saying. Minato immediately began to explain that after she learned to perceive mana, she needed to learn to control it. It is very important to monitor the amount of mana used. Her task is to use mana as efficiently as possible. If you use up all the mana, then over time it will be restored and its amount will increase. And since she has learned to perceive mana from control, there should be no problems. And they talk about something that differs from generally accepted knowledge about magic. If she can't believe it, it's okay. But Maria immediately answered that she believes. because now she trusts him completely. And then they immediately began to move on to the next stage, and she must prepare for battle. And taking off his jacket, Minato told Maria to attack, and she was already ready to fight, and told Minato to show what he was capable of. And as soon as she summoned her magic circles, she immediately began attacking with her first rank of water discs. But Minato stood in the same place where he was a couple of seconds ago, and saw how they flew at him. And at the same moment Minato put out his hand, Maria noticed that her spell had disappeared. But this was the first rank without an elemental magical barrier, and he began to say that if she couldn't break it, then she wouldn't be able to defeat her sister. But Maria continued to attack Minato because she was motivated by what he told her, and as soon as she shot water discs a few more times, Minato said that she should not forget to move, and if she stops in the battle against the mage, then she will lose. Well, as soon as the battle lasted literally a few more minutes, Maria fell to the ground, realizing that she could no longer do it, and Minato approached her and began to say that now it was his turn. Holding it out in his hand, he began to say that, in addition, if she learns to control mana, she will not need to cast the spell. And first, how she used magic, and a huge magical fire began to fly straight into the mannequin, and Mary noticed that her mana was dissipating. But magic can be used without casting a spell if it knows how to control mana. And although Maria didn't fully understand, she was still like that. She decided to ask her mentor again that she might not cast the spell, but for now it would be difficult for her. First, she must learn to simply shorten the spell, and then, when she learns to control mana, she will be able to completely abandon them. And by reducing the spell you will get a significant advantage in battle and will also save a lot of mana while casting them, that is, it will become stronger, and telling Minato that this is an excellent conclusion. But now they will continue because they need to consolidate the knowledge gained, otherwise there will be no point in it, and she must act as if she were on the verge of death. But Maria started screaming because she was scared and that she saw that Minato was pointing his magic circle at her. And a little time later she was lying very tired, but Minato said that they would have to do this every day. And as soon as it got dark, our hero again set out to patrol the areas, but this time he was in the Haryuku area because he understood that there were also monsters during the day, and no matter how much you exterminate them, they did not become smaller. And what all this would do, he didn't understand, but suddenly he noticed that, not far away, a demonic dog approached a girl, and he immediately began to rush straight towards him to protect that man. But as soon as the monsters approached the girl, our hero immediately began to attack him. After destroying it, he asked if she was okay. Well, the girl turned out to be somehow strange or simply stupid and began to take out her phone to film it. But as soon as her camera turned on, Minato realized that there was no need to talk to her and immediately left. After all, he didn't know that she would start taking pictures, not even thanking him and not understanding what kind of people went. And next time he simply needs to go out only with a mask. And the next day Minato continued to study with Maria, but after long training, Maria still found herself exhausted again and fell to the ground. But sighing heavily, it still tried to get to its feet. But she spent a lot of magical power and realized that she needed to recover a little. Minato watched her and realized that there were only a few days left before the competition. Although there was progress, it was minimal, and the fact that Maria loses to her sister and everything, and he doesn't think that she can defeat her like that. But then Maria, getting up, began muttering under her breath that she might give up. But still she was always compared to her sister, and she was not better than her in anything. And the fact that she had already given up a lot of things, but from magic it definitely never seems. But I still decided to tell her that at this rate she couldn't win. But in response he heard a cry that then he could be even tougher with her. But he did not expect this, and with a smile on his face told Maria that now he would not hold back. To which Maria replied that it would even be easier for her. And as soon as she got up, he once again explained to her what needed to be done, and stretching them out into their hands, they continued their hard training. And after some time, Maria was left without strength and Minato had to carry her in his arms. And the next day they continued their studies, and finally she succeeded, said Minato. He heard these words. Maria rejoiced very much and began to fall to the ground and scream loudly that it had finally happened. Her mentor Minato said that she was great, and she did a good job. And soon the day of the competition began, and approaching the magic school, Minato asked her for the last time if she was ready, to which he heard the answer that of course she was ready. but raising their heads they saw strange people and could not understand who they were. But it turned out that many reporters appeared in front of them and began asking questions so that they could say a few words about the upcoming fight in magic, and whether they were in conflict with her sister. But Minato didn't understand what it was, and Maria explained to him that the battle of sisters in the Mizuha family would naturally cause the media to make noise. And Minato realized that regarding a simple battle between students, it was a matter of the name of the bloodline of the magical aristocracy. But inside the Magic Academy, on the stage near which the battle was about to begin, many magicians began to gather, and Minato, noticing this, began to ask Maria if the scale was too large, to which she replied that magical duels rarely happen, so this is a whole event. And as soon as he turned towards her, he saw that she was behaving somehow strangely, but they immediately began to be called to the stage and Maria exploded, answering that they were already on their way. But in fact, she was very nervous, which is why her body began to become cowardly. But Minato understood that she needed support, and told her to do everything in her power. And at that very moment, Maria, hearing these words, collected her thoughts, and in a confident voice she answered no need, that she would do everything in her power. And the fact that Minato is an amazing person and his words hit Maria thought to the very heart. And as soon as Maria entered the stage, she saw her sister, who began to say that how come she didn't run away. But Maria answered her that she could not do it because she had promised herself and her teacher. But her sister thought it was absolutely incredible because she really thought she could win. You are now her sister, stronger than before. But Maria knew that she would definitely win and shouted this to her sister. But then her sister began to answer that she had really grown up in these couple of weeks. And as soon as Maria got ready, she began to closely watch her sister. And I realized that it's scary to think about the difference in the amount of magical power, and the fact that her sister is strong is a fact. But she decided that she would not give in to her, and would definitely win. And as soon as the magic began, Maria and her sister prepared for battle. Well, Maria noticed that her sister did not want to attack first, and she decided to take matters into her own hands and began with a short spell casting. But her sister also jumped to the side and began to call on her magic circle. Minato observed that the constant movement tactics of the main hand was also aware of the battle between magicians. But Maria was so measured that she forgot about this tactic, so the speed advantage of the spell is now lost. And at that very second they both began to use the first rank, and an explosion of water discs was heard throughout the training stage, after which they began to fly apart into pieces. And after that, they both began to cover their faces because the remnants of their magical water discs were flying at them. And Maria noticed that she managed to compensate and became stronger. And her sister began to say that compared to what happened before, she had succeeded and did it in just 2 weeks. And after these words, Mary was glad that she heard that her sister praised her. Well, the expression on her sister's face immediately changed, and she started asking Maria for a schmuck. After all, she simply translated the comparison as praise, which was not praise. But now Mary's sister decided to hang up the rank. And as soon as she began to attack, Maria managed to summon a magic circle and block her attacks. But releasing another second-rank water blitz, she nevertheless knocked Maria off her feet, causing her to begin to fall on her back. And in an instant she simply flew out of the stage and ended up at Minato's feet. And as soon as Minato looked at Maria, who was lying on the ground, he realized that if this were a contest on the speed of the spell, Maria would have a better chance of winning, but her opponent surpasses her. And at the same moment, Sister Maria began to approach them and say that he was an insensitive guy who wouldn't even help her, and wasn't he the one who stood up for her before? But he replied that there was no need to help her. But Maria's sister could not understand what he was saying, and suddenly Maria began to get up, even though her body was shaking, and she began to tell her sister that this was stupidity. It was a direct hit from the second wound and she survived, and now she definitely won't lose to her. And all she has is magic, and even if she loses in something else, she will not yield in magic. And immediately she began to call up her magic circle and recite the spell. But as soon as the spell took effect, she attacked her sister, who also defended herself with the help of a magic circle. And a huge surge of magical power began to spill out from the magic circles. But Maria continued to tell her sister that she would definitely win, and would not give up like last time. But still they left her by force, and she fell to the ground. And they began to say that the magic of participant Maria was exhausted and victory was in the participant's hand. Somehow she tried to get up, but she realized that nothing had worked out for her, and as soon as Minato approached her, he realized that it was a competition and the outcome of which depended on the amount of use of magic in accordance with the coordination of magical power, and she lost in the difference in the amount of magical power as such. And Sister Maria began to say that everything became clear at this point. So this girl has no talent, and Minato should have understood this too. Well, Minato turned to her Sister Maria and began to say that she really didn't have any talent. It's awkward that she doesn't see much progress, and her understanding of the essence also suffers. And the performance turned out to be weak. Well, she has good tenacity. She trained every single day to the point of stupidity, but she trained. And the result of all this is that she really lost. He likes hard-working people like Maria. But upon hearing these words, Maria immediately began to sob. And the fact that Maria is his student, and he will not tolerate bad things being said about her. But Maria continued to sob, and she could not understand why her tears would not stop after the words she heard. And so her sister began to say what part for someone whose magical power indicator is 100. But Minato replied that this magician whose indicator is 100 will defeat her. And Sister Maria said that this is not the first time he has spoken out arrogantly like this. And since it is his will, then she will not be his opponent. And her partner, who was already preparing to go on stage, leaving the scene, she told him to finish the appointment quickly, to which he replied that she could not speak. And as soon as it was not necessary, he carried Maria out of the scene in his arms, and placing her on a chair, he began to tell her to carefully follow his fight. But suddenly she noticed that her body no longer hurt, and the bruises that were on her body disappeared. But Minato, going to the stage, thought that for them it would look simple. So it's impossible to fight at full strength, and the magic power should be no stronger than this indicator, and necessarily without elemental, and without casting a spell. So how do you have to manage without a magical barrier? A direct hit from mine could kill him. And how can you not look at such conditions, and he cannot help but make you worry? And as soon as Minato entered the stage, the guy began to say that he would not hold back. But our hero replied that then he would also be serious. And the audience suddenly started shouting for Ruji to not be serious, and to spare that guy. And at that moment his magical power began to circulate throughout his body, and Minato noticed that his power indicator was somewhere around 8,000, and under normal circumstances there would have been no problems. But now that his indicator is 100, one mistake could cost his life. And as soon as the duel began they stood up. But Ruji, calling up his magic circles, said that there would be no pity. But suddenly he thought about the fact that this guy really could cope with a gang of hooligans. Now he will check this with one of his strong blows, whether he can withstand all his strength. But suddenly something flew into his head and he began to lose his balance. But Minato simply attacked with one precise blow, straight to his head, saying that he was late. But the spectators who watched this battle could not believe what had just happened, and was the battle really over? But that's how it was. It was the end, and victory was for Minato. And Maria's sister immediately ran up to him, and saw that he had lost consciousness from the blow, and she did not hear Minato casting any spell, or what kind of fraud it was. But Minato told Sister Maria that he finished quickly like she demanded. Because of something she began to get angry. Maria, looking at this, could not believe her eyes that Minato had actually defeated his opponent. Well, Sister Maria began to say that, apparently, he was worth something. But Minato immediately answered her that she was really comparing herself, to which she said that it was all him. Tries to have the last word. And at the same moment she began to release magical power, and our hero noticed that the strength of her hand was already somewhere around 10,000, and she was definitely stronger than that guy. The judge watching the battle began to speak. Now the composition of the second competition has accepted changes to the combat abilities of the participant. Minato began to place great hopes. Participant in this round determines the team's victory, and the second duel immediately begins. Minato immediately began attacking Maria's sister, who also began to use the magic circle to protect herself. But our hero decided that now, with his indicator equal to 100, naturally the power of magic is low. Therefore, if you don't aim at the head, there will be practically no effect, and he realized that it was better to defend himself and not move. And as soon as she blocked Minato's attacks, she immediately began to attack back. Her magical water magic began to fly straight towards our hero. But it turned out that this was not enough, and the damage to her face and hands was clear that she did not expect such a turn. That Minato simply dispelled her attack, and with her magical power she did not cause a single bruise, and it looked like this. But the spectators watching this battle began to whisper to each other that she seemed to have hit him, and that guy didn't even get wet. Maria, who was sitting on the chair, was very happy but did not understand what he was using now. But her sister, not knowing what he had just done, continued to attack him, and Minato simply dodged all of her attacks, and she realized that he was not using any magic, he was simply dodging. But Maria suddenly realized that magic is opposed to magic, and even though the difference in the village and Minato does not reduce it at all, and if this is not done, it will obviously be dangerous. And when it comes to the second rank, the speed and mass are different, and Maria's sister began to understand that it should not be such that he would be able to evade, and this guy has no sense of fear at all, and looks like he's thinking everything through, and this is possible if you have the ability to sense and track magical power. Perhaps you need to be quite brave for this. And then she decided that she would use her strongest spell against Minato. Using the third rank of Azure Surge, she began to attack Minato with all her strength. The spectators watching this could not believe it, because that guy would be in trouble if she hit him right. And after a bright explosion of water technology, everyone began to think that the end had come for that guy. Maria's sister, sitting on Earth, realized that he definitely couldn't dodge this. But at that very moment the same thing occurred to her as her partner, and immediately after that he approached her. But she raised her head and was surprised that he was safe and sound and began to ask how he got out. But he replied that he used a magical drain that absorbs magic and simply passed through it. But Sister Maria saw that behind his back there were 2 stripes from her magical attack, and realizing this, she understood for sure that he was telling the truth, and laughing loudly. She could not fully realize that he had passed right through, but she continued to laugh very loudly, and raising her head and looking at the sky, she realized that this was a complete defeat. And at that moment the judge began to say that victory belonged to Minato. Maria caught herself and started running to Minato, asking if everything was okay. He replied that everything was fine, they won. Maria was very happy that she finally managed to wipe her sister's nose. But Ruka began to say that, as promised, she would no longer interfere and now she can do whatever she pleases. But Minato was surprised by what she just said, but turning around, he didn't need to tell Sister Maria that the wounds that he saw on Maria were mild, and it seemed that she succumbed, unlike him. To which Sister Maria began to say that this was not true. Minato said that Maria gained strength in 2 weeks and she herself understands this, and isn't it time to stop being overly caring? Maria at the same moment began to say that she would become even stronger so that she would not have to worry. Sister Maria replied that she believed in it, and as soon as Minato looked at the 2 of them, he realized that everything went better than he expected. But at that same moment he began to feel something strange, and raising his head up, he saw that a bright red color appeared in the sky. Without thinking, he realized that this was foreign magic, that most likely this is a disaster that is approaching them right now. And at that time, in one of the school classes, hooligans were looting the personal belongings of other students. But they soon realized that there were only textbooks here. Tadano still understood that something must be different. How else could he use such magic? But suddenly one of the guys looked out the window and was horrified by what he saw. Raised their heads, they saw that the whole sky was red and that they did not understand what was happening. And is it really possible that there's a catastrophe? One of the guys said, because it can't be that it started. The reporters who filmed this disaster were in complete shock, as were the students who hoped that it was just some kind of phenomenon. But Minato couldn't understand why the disaster began and whether it had anything to do with the fact that they were now in the city, and the first disaster also began here. And is this really just a coincidence? But at the same moment a huge monster began to crawl out of the portals, and as soon as the panic began, the teacher began to tell the students to maintain self-control. But our hero realized that there was no need to hold back now, and he immediately began attacking the monsters that were nearby with his lasers. And calling on a small magic circle to increase his voice, he began to tell everyone to calm down, and as soon as they froze in place, Minato continued to say that at first there is a disaster, only small monsters appear and everything will be fine if you act soberly, and that everyone needs to evacuate to the gym, and they must move in groups and isolate themselves as dangerous. And telling Maria and her sister that they too should seek refuge. But Maria asked our hero what he would do, and he will go to save the people left in the school building. But the teacher asked, will he really go alone? This is reckless. Ryuji, who was standing next to them, said that he would also go. If everything was as he said, there would be no problems because he saw Minato's strength in action. And yet the teacher agreed and said that they should not act as heroes. And that guy asked Minato to say that he would not die. Why did Minato throw up his hands? Because he didn't know. But before leaving, he approached Maria and said that he would already be moving forward. She, in turn, told him to be careful. And that guy immediately began to tell our hero that he would go first because he was in his second year. And for them, running 100 meters in 10 seconds is easy, and will Minato have time to keep up with him? But after these words, our hero began to use his magic circles and accelerate. And as soon as he caught up with us, that guy said that he would go first. And that guy couldn't understand where he got such speed from. But speeding up, Ryuji said that she still doesn't decide anything and he will look at his real strength, and at the same time they will save everyone. Concentrating, Minato realized that the indicator of magical power in the school building was 58. But perhaps there were people who could not control it. And jumped up the mountain, he found himself very high and was able to clearly see the situation at the school. But when he saw the monsters in the school that began to attack the students, he realized that in this case he would deal with them first. Approaching them, he began to activate his magic circle and attack the monsters. And while in the air he continued to attack the monsters, but still realized that he needed to go around all the buildings. A monster behind him who opened his huge mouth, and with his sharp fangs was about to attack Minato from behind. But he knew about him, and raised his other hand and began to destroy him. And suddenly that guy ran into the classroom screaming, "How is the situation?" But all he saw was that our hero had dealt with all the monsters, and approaching him, he said that he trusted the evacuation of the students to him. But suddenly he turned around and started telling Minato to wait for him because it was dangerous to go alone. But as soon as he turned his head completely, he realized that the guy was too fast. And now he simply turns out to be a burden, and there is nothing to object to him. And the fact that in just a few seconds he killed a crowd of magical creatures and without understanding who this guy even was. But Minato continued to offend and thought that if outside the walls you can deal with magic projectiles at a time, then indoors they can hit the students, and there is nothing left but to kill them at a measured pace with low-level magic. I meet more and more magical creatures on my way. He simply destroyed them one by one, and saved many students who were hiding in classrooms. Well, there were a lot of students, and they were all hiding and, sensing people, the monsters gathered near them. But Minato managed to get to them. But still he did not understand that after the rescue, each time accompanying them to the gym would be a waste of time. And at this time Ryuji fought against one of the monsters and told the rest of the guys to calm down and evacuate while he finishes him off. Another guy standing next to him began to look up and showed with his hand that there was something there. And raising their heads they saw that the guys who were flying towards them were lifted into the air by something. But he didn't understand what it was. Was this the work of Minato? And watching the guys descend to the ground, he realized that it looked like things were going well there, and the guys below would definitely cope. But suddenly he began to sense an even greater aura of demonic beasts. The girl who was cornered by demons began to understand that now the end would come for her. After all, a huge number of demonic beasts began to descend from the steps in front of her, but she no longer understood what to do. After all, her legs were simply shaking from fear and she began to sit under the wall with the hope that someone would save her. As soon as the monsters approached a good distance to destroy her, she began to scream for someone to help her. But the girl saw that a bright light appeared and began to destroy the monsters that were near her. But she immediately jumped up because she began to remember that this monster was destroyed in the same way as last time. And so our hero immediately landed next to her after he destroyed the monster and decided to ask the girl if she was injured. But the girl was very surprised that she saw Minato here and began to ask if it was he who saved her. But our hero scratched his head and said something like that. And helping her get up from the floor, she began to ask that then she was in a practical lesson, the battle was also he. To which our hero replied that it was such a thing. And as soon as she got to her feet, she immediately began to thank Minato for saving her twice already. The hero told her not to worry because there was nothing special here. And the girl was deeply touched by such words. But at that moment Ryuji appeared and began to say who to save next. And Minato began to tell the girl to follow him, and then she would be safe. But moving on, Minato began to understand that there was still a decent number of people left who needed help and were waiting. There was no time in the police, they needed to be saved as quickly as possible. But at this time many influential people gathered in another building, and their representative began to say that a disaster had begun at the Academy of Divine Magic. But other guys started saying that the disaster happened 50 years ago, and there shouldn't be any more of them. And I asked the president what the next step would be. To which the president began to answer that they were contacting the aristocracy and the Central Department of the Police Department to combat monsters, and the ground self-defense forces had already been prepared. Other men began to say that in the case of the disaster, the defense forces consisted only of magicians, and they did not have magicians capable of fighting monsters. But the president understood that this was the other side of the peaceful situation after the disaster, and most of the military spending was aimed at defense in international affairs. And the only ones fit to fight against monsters are the police and the magical aristocracy. And if the same thing happens 50 years ago, then they no longer have Ishigami Minato. And the police who were driving their car began to discuss that the disaster had really begun. And nothing happened for 50 years, which means the peaceful situation was temporary but no problems. After all, that's why they exist, which belong to the Central Department of the Police Department for fighting monsters. And they will already try to destroy all the monsters. Reporters who surrounded the helicopter near the Magic Academy said that a disaster had begun at the Academy of Divine Magic. The sky turned red and monsters appeared one after another, and the fact that within the walls of the school monsters suddenly appeared and they and the students evacuated to the gym. The teacher who was with the students in the gym told them that among their opponents, they only had magical animals, and they could cope with them by joining forces. Other students watched the live broadcast that was broadcast outside, and it said that teachers and students are trying as hard as they can, but there are a lot of monsters so they cannot leave the academy. And the fact that this academy was not far from the city center. Huge monsters began to appear in the very center of the city, and as soon as people noticed, they began to move in different directions. Other people watching all this from a high building understood that horror was now happening on the streets. Minato, who was in a hurry to help everyone, quickly suddenly began to think that this place was simply teeming with monsters and that things were probably gradually moving towards the second phase. The monsters that appear become stronger as the phases progress, and no matter how many monsters you kill, they do not become smaller. And until the boss is destroyed, monsters will continue to appear continuously. The boss, in turn, appears in the last phase and you need to hold out until this moment. A catastrophe is truly a troublesome matter, and in total there are about 20 people. They are scattered throughout the building, so even rescue is difficult. But as soon as Minato saved everyone he met on his way, he began to decide where to go next. But in one of the classes there was that stupid classmate who was annoying our hero all the time, and he continued to fight against the monsters that were attacking him. But still it was very difficult for him, and he realized that it was useless, and he could no longer fight back. After all, in front of them now stands a soldier of the demonic army against whom they cannot do anything. And the fact that they didn't understand why the Guardian again, and the fact that they got involved in this for a stupid reason by searching Minato's briefcase. Tadano began to cry like a little girl and say that Minato would kill him with one blow. But why can't he? But suddenly he heard the words because he is weak, and immediately after these words there was a huge explosion of fire magic. Who destroyed the guards from whom only his 2 legs remained. Put a video, she will already take off your head 30 ago. What to do now? Add accept me delete video. This is a call with a machine. But raising his head, he again saw Minato in front of him, who had appeared from where, and simply destroyed that monster, and leaving Minato noticed how those guys immediately became sour without even thanking him. Tanadu began to get angry because this guy saved him again, but as soon as Minato walked a few meters away, the guys started running towards him and shouting for him to stop, and ask why he saved them because he must hate him, and turning around Minato said that there was no reason. He helped because he could only do it, and that's all. But the guys couldn't understand why he said this, and why he was so kind to them.